one of the byproducts of Putin's invasion of Ukraine has essentially been the collapse of what was left of Russia's kind of remaining informal empire around the world. Basically, it no longer has the bandwidth, it no longer has the resources to be able to support old client states and the like, and to play some of the geopolitical games that went with that.
Turn to India then, Mark. Just explain briefly, it's not a relationship we talk about much. What is the India-Russia relationship like, economically, diplomatically? What's the state of play there at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a deeply pragmatic one. I mean, from the Indians' point of view, to put very brutally, they don't really care that much about the fact that Putin is fighting a war in Ukraine. After all, from their point of view, they have been on and off been fighting a war with Pakistan that Pakistan has been doing often with considerable Western assistance. And the West does nothing about that. So I think in some ways India is channeling the same kind of attitude we find very broadly in the global South, which is, oh, it matters when it's Europeans, or even more crudely, oh, it matters when they're white. But all these other wars in other parts of the world, essentially the West hasn't really cared about. So there is a degree to which they regard the West as hypocritical on this, even while they're fully aware of the degree to which the Russians are the bad guys in these circumstances. If you look at the Indian press, I mean, although there is a lot of, a certain amount of kind of sentimental pro-Russianism, which in part dates back to the days when there was much closer relationship with the old Soviet Union, and the Soviets were regarded as sort of champions of the decolonization struggles and so forth. But at a policy level, it's just pragmatic. From the Indians' point of view, they are very happy to be able to triangulate between Washington, between Brussels, between Beijing. And from their point of view, also with Moscow. They still need a certain amount of trade with Russia for the sort of spare parts for their largely legacy Soviet and Russian military kit. This is the thing about when you buy military kit from a power, you're not just simply buying something off the shelf. You're actually buying a long-term relationship, because you will need training and maintenance and upgrades and spare parts and so forth. So to a degree, they're still locked in there. They are very, very happy to get cheap oil from Russia, which is absolutely necessary for their own burgeoning economic sort of growth. And in some ways, they are very happy also to be able to play the Russia card. We could be closer to Russia in their dealings with the West, whether it's in terms of improved visa conditions for their nationals, as we've seen, coming to the UK, or in terms of arms trade. You want to wean us off Russian kit. You don't want us to be buying Chinese kit. Well, that's fine, but give us a good deal. So, again, this is a classic example of the fact that we now live in a multipolar world. There was that very brief period. There was sort of the two-way sort of shaping of the world by the two superpowers in the Cold War. There was a brief period of essentially American-dominated unipolarity. Now we see such a sort of a proliferation of centres, and the Indians are both a power in their own right, but also very happy to play off these other powers against each other.
And we've spoken about the economics there. Militarily, India's a vast and growing country. It's got a well-trained and fairly active military, considering its tensions with Pakistan. It's also a nuclear power. What is the military relationship between India and Russia, both sort of more positive, collaborative aspects and areas where there might be more friction?
I mean, there aren't really areas of friction these days. I mean, particularly, one of the byproducts of Putin's invasion of Ukraine has essentially been the collapse of what was left of Russia's kind of remaining informal empire around the world. Basically, it no longer has the bandwidth, it no longer has the resources to be able to support old client states and the like, and to play some of the geopolitical games that went with that. So actually, Russia has kind of pulled in its horns to focus on Ukraine, which again essentially means that in India doesn't really face any particular problems. The relationship, I mean, look, there are still Indian officers going to Russian command schools for additional training, just as there are Indian officers coming to Britain and elsewhere. As I said, there is still Russian kit. There is still quite a bit of, not quite sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but certainly this sort of, common problems actually relating to China, in that there's certain suggestions that actually the Indians and the Russians both watch the Chinese military very, very carefully, and to a degree share, if not sort of raw intelligence, but certainly their own assessments, as each tries to get a sense of, how far this rising Chinese military force, which from the Indians' point of view particularly is regarded as a serious threat, how far that actually is developing. So again, from a very transactional relationship, it's by no means a sort of a small scale one. And frankly, look, I haven't been to Moscow since I was banned in 2022. But one could see that there were fairly regular delegations of not just government officials, but also business people and the like who would be there, and the Russians would always make a point of rolling out the red carpet for them.
How much influence does one have over the other? How much pressure could Narendra Modi put on Putin, for example?
This is one of those interesting situations where, again, he has influence in two particular ways. One of them, again, is just in terms of oil. However, for him to not buy cheap Russian oil would be self-harming for India. So again, it's a weapon that has a very high price tag. The other one is in terms of influence. Look, it is clear that Putin is deeply conscious of the degree to which Russia has become isolated in some corners of the world, and very, very much wants to portray this notion that we're not really isolated. It's just the West. Actually, he now has been calling the global South the world majority, which is a very nice little sort of bit of semantic byplay. So he now says, look, the world majority is on our side. Look at China, look at India, look at Brazil. Very much they trumpet the rise of the BRICS sort of trading bloc as an example of the fact that Russia is not isolated. In that respect, India plays quite a significant sort of psychological as much diplomatic role. So if the Indians started getting heavy, then the Russians pay attention to that, as they did, for example, when Putin was being a little bit too free with his talk about potentially turning to nuclear weapons. And both the Indians and the Chinese came together to basically read Putin the riot act and say, look, even discussing this is dangerous. We absolutely don't want to risk breaking the nuclear taboo. And Putin had to listen. So, he has a certain amount of moral influence, but again, there's a limit to how far that'll go. Putin was willing to listen because he wasn't planning on using nuclear weapons anyway. He was using nuclear weapons essentially as a propaganda tool. Fair enough, he can sort of shelve that. But if Narendra Modi turns around and says, you've got to pull out of Ukraine right now, Putin's going to say, no, I'm not going to do it.
And a couple more questions. Do you think that Trump will get more success putting pressure on New Delhi through this threat of secondary tariffs than he would on Beijing, for example, or is it just as ineffectual?
Well, it's interesting that the Indian oil and gas minister, when he was asked about this, was very, very relaxed and just simply says, well, we find, sometimes you find these kind of things being said in order to put pressure on the parties in a negotiation. So he was very much presenting this as language rather than genuine policy. Like everyone else, the Indians are going to have to wait and see. This is the thing. Trump has given himself a deadline. And, particularly in the current environment, he's probably acutely conscious that, another climb down would be politically dangerous for him. But on the other hand, we have very little sense that the Americans really are looking to basically pick a fight with India, as well as all the other fights that they've picked around the world. So, we wait and see. And this is always the problem, frankly, of trying to predict anything now in Trump world. That what might be the plan today may well not be the plan tomorrow. But I do think that given that China is increasingly antagonistic, China really, actually is regarding Trump as problematic, it's clear. To also alienate India essentially means that you are losing what usually have been the sort of the two reciprocal poles of, rising politics and rising military power in Asia. And from a strategic point of view, if you are worried about China's actions, you want to have India on side. You want there to be, I'm going to put it in very sort of dramatic sense, the risk of a knife towards China's back if it pivots entirely towards Taiwan and the Pacific. So in this respect, I think, I know for a fact there are certainly voices within the American national security community who are saying, actually, this is not the time to be alienating India.
And just finally, to make you play the dangerous game of predictions, how far do you think India can continue to ride both horses in terms of Moscow and Washington?
To be honest, I imagine it will have the capacity to do that. India is in some ways in a sweet spot in that it is powerful enough to be important, but it's just sufficiently sort of below the radar. People don't think of it in the same terms as they do China and Russia, even though arguably they should. But it's just about that so that it can still maintain this kind of strategic equipoise more easily. It's not being forced to make choices. And this is, I think, one of the dangerous things about Trump's ultimatum, in that it makes it harder for India to continue to not have to make choices, because quite frankly, it's not entirely clear which side they would choose, or whether they would just simply sort of say a plague on all your houses. And we, for example, still do depend on India for intelligence assistance in that part of the world.
Mark Galeotti, thank you so much for giving up so much of your